So I'm really delighted to be here today to launch The Changing of the Guard. This is really a book whose reputation precedes it, and I'm sure that many of you will have been closely following the media coverage surrounding its publication. In the last few weeks, it's been called everything from a blockbuster critique with heaps of evidence to a half-true crop of scuttlebutt. Sorry, Simon, to read that out. But those two evaluations actually came from the same media outlets. So that's saying nothing about all of the other media outlets out there. I don't think anyone at Scribe, and least of all Simon, has been surprised by this. The book was certainly not going to be published quietly and allowed to slip into obscurity. So it's gratifying to see it being taken seriously, and perhaps even more so when it ruffles feathers than when it preaches to the choir. This is really a book for anyone who wants to understand where our army's gone wrong, anyone who cares about the future of the British military. But beyond that, this book is for anyone who cares about accountability. Rather than being an ad hominem attack, it's really a lack of accountability, which is the ultimate target that it sets out to expose. And Simon's painstaking, thoughtful work shows just how difficult it is to shine a light where obfuscation has been allowed to reign. Exposing institutional failings isn't easy, it doesn't make you popular, but this kind of writing is what we need just now more than ever. And I think investigating how the organisations we trust have gone so wrong is some of the most important work a writer could do. We would really be lost without people like Simon, people who are paying attention, people who are committed to making us pay attention, no matter how uncomfortable it is. And that's why I really mean it when I say how very proud we are to have published this book and how pleased that with a few detours along the way, ultimately Simon chose us to publish him. Now let's all raise a glass. We hope you've got a glass at home, we'll assume you do, and say a toast to the changing of the guard. Cheers.
Yes.
I'll introduce the speakers, so you probably have some idea of who Simon Acamp is by now. I should point out that as well as being the author of The Changing of the Guard, I'll get my copy, just here. He's also worked for the New York Times, Reuters and Newsweek, and his writings appeared in publications including The Economist, GQ. You can actually read an extract from this book in the edition of GQ that's just come out. Financial Times, New Statesman, the Paris Review, many, many other places. And he also co-hosts the writing podcast, Always Take Notes. And Alex Perry is a non-fiction writer. He's the author of The Good Mothers and several other books. He reported on Afghanistan and Iraq and has covered over 30 conflicts around the world. So I'll hand over to Simon and Alex now.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for finding time on their Tuesday evening to come here. I'm really touched that you are. Just before we get in, I'd like to say a huge thanks to Sarah, who has been without whom this book would not have happened. Is the simplest thing to say. She's been a beacon of professionalism, and she's also an extremely brave woman. So I really would like to extend a huge vote of gratitude to her and to her colleagues at Scribe. And I'm also really grateful to Alex for coming and joining me this evening. I've known Alex since we worked together at Newsweek 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, and he's been a real mentor to me along the way in all sorts of things, from the mechanics of, I'll just come a bit closer to the screen, in just a few things from the mechanics of writing literary nonfiction to dealing with publishers and agents and editors, and particularly during the difficult gestation of this book. Alex was a huge source of strength and advice, so I'm really touched that he's here tonight. But he's not going to put away his rigorous journalistic sense as well, so you should get some tough questions too. But yeah, let's get into it then.
Yeah, all right. Good evening, everyone. Simon, I'll jump right in with kind of big picture. You write, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, that one big reason for the British Army to fight in Iraq is to keep in with the Americans, while also kind of somehow proving their superiority to the Americans, because what worked in Belfast will somehow work in Basra. You go on to report how, without much of a plan or objective or even working kit, the army muddles through at best before retreating in humiliation and later failing to achieve much of anything in Afghanistan. How much of this book is about the British Army struggling to find a place in the 21st century, and how much of it is about Britain itself?
I think it's both, but I'm really glad that you've touched on that, because what I hoped to achieve right from the beginning was to write a book that would jump the fence of military history. So there's clearly a very engaged audience who feels strongly about these things and who reads about them, but I wanted to write a book that would cover that market, but also would be well beyond it. So everything from the way it's written, from our attempt to purge military language and acronyms, but also really to make a claim that I think this is a book about Britain told through the lens of the army. That would be my intention and my hope with it. And I think there's a broader story here about accountability, really, and about how we and our place in the world. Those are the two pivotal threads, I think, that run through the book.
Okay. Well, paraphrasing again, and this is a subject we'll come back to undoubtedly. You spend much of the book making the case that the army is irascibly defensive, in denial, resistant to change. And then on hearing your accusations, the army's, well, some of its commanders and the MOD became irascibly defensive, denied everything and resisted all calls for change. So what conclusions might we draw from their reaction?
I think there's definitely a truism here that the arguments in the book about the army's difficulty to deal with change has been reflected both in the complicated journey of the book's publication and in some of the debate that we've seen after it's been published. I think what is fascinating though is the army is not a single entity. You know, that's another thing I wanted to make clear in the book, that it is, in its essential regimental organization, it's a federation of different interest groups and organizations, and how the book has been received and responded to within the military has been hugely varied. And broadly and crudely, I would say it's a generational divide, generally, that up to a certain level, people have been extremely positive about it, and clearly at the top end there is a lot of disquiet. But I think there's a lot of nuance to that. So I've had, real very, very positive feedback from a couple of retired generals, which might surprise some people, and also people who are much younger who've been very, very angry at it. So I think what I tried to do in the book was to talk about what happened, but really to drive into this idea of why stuff happens, and particularly this idea of how an institution is governed by the incentives that are set up in it, as much and as to a greater extent as the individuals within it. And I was thinking about this today, actually, before we spoke. And one point that I didn't really raise in the book, but I think it's interesting, is if you look back 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of discussion, a kind of institutional fear that this so-called PlayStation generation of soldiers would be soft and would not be able to equip themselves on the battlefield. And that proved to be palpably false. That these, brave and perhaps slightly foolish young men were willing to do, and women, were willing to do very brave things, as they have in previous combat, and I'm sure they will be in the future. But the way the institution was set up, the rules of the game, as it were, made response very difficult.
Well, okay. I mean, you alluded there to the battle to get the book published. But walk us through that, because it was, well, I thought it was a fairly outrageous process, as you know. But yeah, perhaps for those who don't know,
so again, happy to discuss. So the book was, and again, this will require a bit of explanation of the mechanics of publishing and so forth, but I'll try and explain it in a way that is familiar to anyone who's not germane with that. So the book was sold off proposal in 2015, which is a non-fiction book, as opposed to a novel, is generally sold off a proposal, which is, in the broadest sense, 3 chapters and a synopsis. This was a bit different. And there was a lot of interest. So 5 British publishers, major ones, bidded. 2 PRH imprints, John Murray, Little Brown, Hachette, HarperCollins, which was great. I mean, I'd spent a lot of my 20s trying to write novels, and this was, the kind of delight that I was absolutely delighted. So I got a book deal with imprint PRH, and I spent 3 years writing the book, and in parallel to doing my magazine work. And there's no doubt at all that my reporting stirred disquiet in the army, undoubtedly. I think that it's a small institution, people know each other. It talked to 260 people, and I'd been to Afghanistan the year before I got the deal, and then I did a lot of interviewing. And that all, I think I was able to do that really because I was seen as in some ways a known quantity. You know, I was totally honest at what I was doing. I was writing a book, but obviously because of my background, I spent a year in the army before university and so forth. There was perhaps a sense that I was friendly forces in the military jargon. But then I then had to do a whole process of cross-checking and fact-checking, as one would with any book like this. And particularly in a book where the framework is, this is about something that did not go well. So I think if you're writing a book about the Falklands, for instance, what you would find would be a huge battle of people to take credit in general. I mean, there were obviously exceptions, but to take credit for their part in this victory. And because that was not the outcome of these conflicts, there was often the opposite process of people trying to say it was their fault and so forth. And what I tried to do in parallel with the kind of tradition of American long form writing that we both inhabit is to hear everyone out and compare and then lay out how it is. But that is, as you know yourself, can be a pretty vexed process. And it's certainly true that I had created a kind of bow wave of alarm within the army doing that. Which is a function as well, the fact that it's a small institution, they all know each other. But the book was due to be published in March 2019, and the straw that broke the camel's back was that I had a visiting fellowship at Oxford at the Changing Character of War program, and an academic there who has, I won't name him, but he has close relations with the army, he wrote to Random House and said they'd be sued. And I think they panicked basically, and they demanded that I give the manuscript to the British Ministry of Defence. They demanded copy approval, which is that everyone signs off about what's written about them. And they then, we tried to negotiate, they then cancelled my contract. So they then demanded that I pay back all the money they had given me, so the advance, which is the money you're paid in advance. And they also demanded that I pay their legal fees. So this was obviously, I think, an attempt to, you know, they made a rushed decision, I think. And a lot of what has happened has been about actually rushed decisions, as I explore in the book, have consequences. But what happened then was I talked to a lot of people, including yourself, who gave advice. I then asked, I was able to mobilize a coalition of 7 or 8 press freedom organizations, organized primarily by the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, which is an energetic German NGO, but also Reporters Without Borders, Index on Censorship, and so forth. They wrote to the top management at PRH, to the Germans at the top of the firm, which didn't move their position. So I'd been in contact with The Guardian. I gave the material to The Guardian. I felt it was ultimately important that someone who wasn't me wrote about this, because obviously I was going to say it was an outrage. You know, it was my book. I was hugely partial. So it needed someone else to come in. So The Guardian wrote about it in 2019. And after that, I got in touch with Scribe. And Scribe had, you know, they had form here. You know, Sarah has done this before. So particularly with a book called $1 Billion Whale that was published, was meant to be published in the UK. It's an account of the Malaysian 1MDB scandal, published in the US, and the major British publisher wouldn't do it. And Scribe stepped in here and had done it before, which again, I think, you know, was a really ballsy call. And I went to see Scribe and they wanted to do it. And there was then an extensive and pretty difficult process of trying to get the copyright back from PRH, because they refused to release the copyright to the book unless I signed a non-disclosure agreement, which I wasn't willing to do. So in the end, it was bought out. So all the money from Scribe is going to Random House, and I still theoretically owe Random House quite a lot more money, but I'm hoping that that's not going to happen. So it's been a long and difficult process, but I do think, again, there is this sort of distillation of like, this is kind of what the book's about, right? You know, that if the book is about these narratives are very difficult to challenge, and certainly, you know, I could have done stuff differently, and I could have learned, you know, there's a lot. It was my first book. There were things that I could have learned and done in a more nuanced and sophisticated way. But I think, you know, it's been a long and difficult road, but partly what I think it's been about as well has been the network versus the hierarchy. So, you know, I essentially what PRH did was a kind of fiat decision of like, you will do this, you will do that. And what I was able to do, you know, I did not by any stretch of the imagination do this alone. It was a huge network of people, some of whom I'd met like yourself, others who I hadn't, who helped and who provided advice and talked through it. And it's just seen in the chat, there's a question if anything's been removed. I mean, we pseudonym 2 people and slightly tweaked one section, but no, this is published as is. So, you know, that's how it's been.
Okay, well, thanks for being so candid, Simon. I mean, as you know, my reaction was it was fairly outrageous, and I didn't understand what kind of business PRH thought they were in. But that brings me on to my next question. Well, what surprised me in the book, or one of the things that surprised me, is how obsessed the brass is, and the rank and file, with image. You know, officers are paranoid about bad news leaking out, tried to ban this book, but are constantly trying to pass on the right kind of news. Soldiers always seem to be having half an eye on a book deal. There's the faintly absurd regimental portraits. There's a weird undergrounding kind of bang bang TikTok, I suppose we would call it. And there's and then there's the sort of industrial scale fabrication of the Andy McNabb books and their various kind of iterations. I mean, I'm sure we share this. My experience of people who are obsessed with image is that they're worried about the truth. How much of this is kind of conventional PR management from an institution trying to look good to funders, to recruits, and to the public, and how much of it is something more sinister, deceit, trying to cover up inadequacy?
I think there's another thread actually, which kind of links through those points, which is that the core business of armies does not happen all the time, and the knock-on, you know, fighting. So they do other things certainly, but the war fighting, which is the term the army would use, but essentially the opportunity to do what you're trained for, that is not constant, and that is no fault of armies at all. It's just a situation they find themselves in, but the knock-ons of that are myriad. And so that is why, for instance, a peacetime army has to make a constant case for resources against a hypothetical, which is what you're seeing with the defense review at this stage. It's also why it's so difficult to assess promotion in peacetime, because things are not going on for real. But it can also be that when the opportunity comes to do it for real, it is a precious thing. You know, that is a key thing. And I think a point that actually is in many ways the big explanation of why post 9/11 campaigns happened is that they were run out of a sense of institutional preservation. And again, that can sound very cynical. So this comment that was famously made about use them or lose them with regard to sending battalions to Afghanistan post-Iraq. You know, that Dannatt has been, Richard Dannatt, who was head of the army, has been heavily criticized that, but I think in many ways it's very understandable. So these were people who had devoted their careers to the institution, and fundamentally the fight that they thought, consciously or not, but I think this is true, the fight that they really were fighting was to preserve the institution which they loved. And I think love is the right word there. And because of that, there is a sense that, you know, ultimately the end justifies the means. That often is, you know, that actually we need to do this and we need to, and it can get tied up with some quite complicated notions of what we're doing this because we think it for the boys, or, you know, for the best thing. So if you look at a lot of the reason that the army is so guarded, they will claim, is we are protecting our people. You know, we are protecting our people in the interests of if they are hurt or if something like that happens. And you can understand that impetus. And again, with, for example, with medals, which I write about in detail, a lot of the reason that the medal became this kind of currency that rewarded not necessarily the right behavior was because you had commanding officers who really wanted to do what they thought was best for their boys, you know, who wanted to write everyone up. So I think certainly, you know, I think the army has a fundamental problem with command accountability and lessons learning, and it's not unique purely to armies. But I think it is helpful and perhaps more compassionate to try and understand some of the reasons why those things occur. You know, it's, and we've seen what happened with this book. We've seen, this is the third book in 10 years that the British Army has tried to ban, looking at Mike Martin's work, looking at Toby Harnden's. So there's a problem here, but it is, in terms of resolving that problem, both in our national discourse and in the book as itself, it's more helpful to consider why than what, I think.
Okay, I mean, on a related question, we'll move on to other stuff, but how much harder do you think it is critiquing a profession, for want of a better word, of heroes? I mean, I have more experience of being critical of aid workers, who are lovely people 99% of the time, but if you criticize them, my God. And you know, there's something about a profession that has an aspiration to make you better, to make you into something admirable, that when you question that, or you even say the result has been something different, it can get quite nasty, it can get quite personal, because from their point of view, it's very personal. You're attacking not just their institution they work for, but actually who they are. I wonder if you think that stands in the way of kind of healthy, meaningful introspection here, self-examination.
Yeah, I really think it does. I mean, I think it's been very interesting. Clearly, again, when the book has come out, there is clearly a stratum of British society that thinks that any kind of criticism of the army is treason. That I think that is the word that it is perceived as. And I think there's also, without being too kind of cod Freudian about this, this book is a book that's a lot about denial. If the scene at the beginning where everyone is, it's the end of the Afghan campaign and people are sort of self-congratulating themselves. That's about denial. And the classic point when denial is challenged, the response is rage, right? I mean, that is and that is true on an individual and a collective level. But I think the hero narrative, a lot of serving soldiers are really uncomfortable with it. They don't feel that it fits their experiences. And I think it is problematic. I think that ultimately we should talk about the army in the way we talk about the NHS, right? Like, it's a publicly funded organization that deals with people's lives. And that is, that would be a huge departure, I think. But it's also interesting, I've done a couple of big interviews with American military podcasts about the book over the last week. And obviously, I mean, they have skin in the game here as well, because there's a lot about the US in the book, but they do have a level or a modicum of emotional distance compared to the Brits. And one of them, who's a guy at West Point, said, I don't think this is an attack on the army. Like, this is sort of taking a knee after 20 years and saying, like, let's think about what happened. But yeah, I think this sort of peculiarly British idea, and it fits a bit with this notion of pomposity, right, which is something that comes across in the book in a number of cases. And I think pomposity can correspond to age, but it really doesn't exclusively correspond to age. I spoke to people in their 50s and 60s who were profoundly unpompous individuals, and to people who were in their 20s who were pompous. And I think that pomposity is dangerous because it creates this sort of idea that it's better not to discuss and everything like that. And I think I suppose the takeaway would be that this idea that let's not talk about it, let's cover everything up, let's have this narrative, let's sell the shoot 'em up books, which is the technical term for the kind of McNab stuff. There's an idea that is good for the army, and it may make things easier in the short term, but I think it's problematic long term. And ultimately, that this was an institution that mattered to me. I'd spent a part of my life in it, and a lot of my friends have been involved. And I think, people are owed that conversation now.
Mm. Well, I mean, turning to what the future might mean, unpick Boris's announcement of 16.5 billion investment. I mean, for a generation, as far as I can remember, military news has been dominated by one word: cuts. So what does this mean? What should the army be doing with the money? What does your reporting suggest that they will do with the money?
I think they're very different questions. So clearly there's a big political element to Johnson, for a Tory Prime Minister, to up defence spending. And there's a huge, again, for people who aren't familiar with this, what is going on at the moment is there's a huge discussion of what's called an integrated review. So this is a big sit down and discussion about what we're going to spend the money on. And what I think is key for again, if people aren't familiar with this is presented as a kind of ends-based discussion, what kind of army we want, what kind of military we want. But in many ways, in the way it works, the process, it's a resource war, right? It's a resource war inside Whitehall between the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And historically, the Navy and the Air Force prevail in these conflicts because they have large equipment programs like jet fighters or aircraft carriers, which are so massive that they're difficult to cancel. So what has been very interesting is the army has twice been told, I think Tim Shipman had a piece in the Sunday Times on this, but twice been told to rewrite their submission to the integrated review, basically send their homework back. And I think there is a case now that there is what would be termed a revolution in military affairs, a fundamental technology-driven change in the way these things can work. So one of those happened post-Vietnam and pre-Gulf War with smart weapons and things like that. But this idea that autonomy, AI, has fundamentally changed the way that wars will be fought. It will take place over the horizon. And there's been a lot of examination of what's happened with Armenia and Azerbaijan. People tend to kind of try and read the runes in this. So there could be a sort of huge change with it. I think a point that has been completely missed in the coverage, but there's a really interesting historical point of comparison with this, which is the Duncan Sands Defense Review of 1957, which was, again, an idea, a big white paper, technology driven, and that perceived that warfare was going to be revolutionized by missiles. You didn't need manned aircraft, and it was wrong. So, you know, it's extremely difficult to know how accurate the future gazing is. But I think fundamentally, there was an interesting thread about this again on Twitter yesterday, that the army has not, as someone has alluded to, Trevor Sheehan in the thread, has not worked out what it's for. And I think it's a really difficult question, but the reason that conversation cannot happen, in my view, is because there has not been an acceptance of what has happened. The reason that the US was able to do what they did after Vietnam, which again, without getting lost in the weeds, was a huge reassessment of doctrine, of equipment, of what, again, without getting too much detail, what they did was they brought in a whole range of new equipment, from the main battle tank to the Bradley fighting vehicle. And they set up these big training centers with kind of laser quest, where people could do free-form exercises where literally the best team won. And the reason they did that was because they admitted they lost the Vietnam War. And the problem that I think Britain is in at the moment is because of the way our institution is structured, it literally cannot accept that. It cannot say, you know, it cannot say this wasn't great, what can we do differently? And so I imagine what the army first sent was a sort of cunning plan to try and keep as much money for itself as possible, and that's been sent back. And where that piece of political military interaction played out, you know, it will be fascinating to see what happened. Clearly, Dominic Cummings was a major force in driving this, but Cummings has left the building.
Well, I mean, one of the major threads of your book, and I mean, it's something that we've talked about before, is you know, discussing what an army is for. It does seem a truism that you can't build a country or free a people at the point of a gun. You know, that's been the experience of Afghanistan and Iraq for the last 20 years. So why is the army still doing that? Why try and use the military for a purpose that it's almost uniquely unsuited to? And how much of this is a search for relevance?
I think there's two points there. So one point that I think is hugely significant in working out why militaries do what they do is what's called technological determinism, which is this idea that military kit is hugely expensive and its unit cost is rising per generation. The cost of a tank or a warplane goes up and up and up. And so if you build it, there is a huge incentive to use it because it's cost so much, but also because so many people's careers and so forth are tied up in it. So the classic example of this is the B-29 aircraft at the end of World War II. So everyone is familiar with the debate about the atomic bombings of Japan, but the fire bombings of Japan that happened beforehand, which killed more people, I believe, the reason they took place was because the B-29 cost more than the atom bomb, right? That was why it was hugely expensive. So essentially, you know, if military kit gets built, there's an enormous incentive to use it, rightly or wrongly. Again, it's not army's fault, it's just the way these things are structured. I think you have to also look at the heritage of what the army had done pre-2001. So there was this long heritage of small wars, counterinsurgency through Ireland, Malaya, and so forth. And there was a real belief that this was transferable. And it didn't work in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I think there's an interesting debate, as you say, about whether this is possible at all in, you know, can you form a country at the point of arrival? I think it's very difficult. There's one point which is a tiny footnote in the book, which probably most people haven't read, but is by a former Royal Welsh officer who was in Basra at the end. And I think what he said is like, the reason we can't do this is we're not allowed to do what we did in the 50s. Like, we tortured people, like we censored the media, like we did all this, you know, sort of stuff. Like we had huge troop densities, and it's probably right that we can't do that anymore, you know? So I think you have to, you know, armies want stuff to do, and that is really understandable. You know, it's really, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a surprising thing. I think the challenge for defense policy is about creating a system of incentives that guides us to do things that are achievable rather than throwing us into situations that are very difficult. Because once they begin, the momentum is so huge. You know, that is the point, that there's so much investment that armies are almost uniquely vulnerable to the sunken cost fallacy, particularly because people die, you know, so that once that starts happening, to say, you know, the fact that people are saying now maybe the Afghan campaign was for nothing, I mean, that would have been unthinkable 5-6 years ago, you know, to say that. So once the ball starts rolling, it's very, very difficult to stop it. So I think the thing is about setting up the system to kind of work to point us in the right direction. That's the big challenge.
Well, I mean, we talk about this very much from a sort of institutional basis and often a kind of top-down basis, or certainly looking at the command structure. But we pick up something from a passage in the book about Afghanistan and Helmand and Royal Marine Alexander, and the contrast between his unit, 42 Commando, which was all war all the time, and the subtler approach taken by 45 Commando next door. I found this fascinating for a number of reasons, but we tend to think of soldiers on the ground as kind of being the executors of orders from afar. But here was an example about the possibility of the reverse, right? About the ability of a single unit or even a single man to wield power and influence or even dictate policy. So what does that mean for marshalling the future? What does it mean for accountability?
It's a really interesting question. I just see that someone in the thread has raised the point about writing about Marine and the point that he's not in the army, and that whether this fits into a book about the army. And I think that is an interesting question. I think that, you know, the reason initially that I wanted to write about Marine was I had an ambition. I can say this now, I think, that the same day that that incident happened, Cheryl Cole, formerly of Girls Aloud, was on a morale-boosting visit to Camp Bastion. And I had this idea that I could write 15 kilometers away from where it happened, I could write a parallel narrative about this extremely gritty scene that became a huge scandal, and essentially the encounter of the UK celebrity industrial complex with 21st century war, and that those paths would cross in the same day. And I was unable to do that because Cheryl Cole's visit to Camp Bastion is the most closely guarded British military secret of the entire post 9/11 campaign. Like literally no one would talk about it at all. So, you know, and that too became a slightly different thing. And at that point, I didn't know about any of this 4245. I should say also that, yeah, it's 42 and 45, because there will be people saying it's not 42 and 45, and let's assuage them. I think, you know, the fascinating thing about that is that, again, giving some context here, is that these two units were taking diametrically different approaches. And what really struck it for me was when I was really into the reporting, and I saw that one of my sources told me that Blackman's company, you know, there's a documentary film of them, they're getting blown up, things are really gritty and stuff. And a guy told me, yeah, we were 600 meters away and we spent 7 months without firing a shot in anger, and we never found an IED. And suddenly, from that point, you're like, okay, something weird is going on here. And you know, it was intensely driven from the top down. But the other layer of irony about it is that Oliver Lee, who was the 4-5 commanding officer, had written at Shrivenham his thesis on battlefield atrocity, and he'd made exactly your point, that in the environment we live today, the media environment, individual malfeasance by individual soldiers could have a strategic effect. And I think the other point that's fascinating about that is this idea of when does something become a thing in the army, an issue. And this is a huge point I raised right at the beginning, talking about this idea of the Bakshi, like Bakshi kit, which is kit that doesn't exist on any store ledger, so that if someone's lost something, the quartermaster can just slide you one, and the whole system, it doesn't have to get reported. And essentially, the paradox here is that armies need to be authoritarian because they need a system that will work in systems of terror and fear. But authoritarian systems are incredibly rigid, and they're almost impossible to live in on a day-to-day basis. So you have to have a whole system of breaking rules alongside making rules. And there always has to be this idea of like, are we going to deal with this in-house, or is it going to become official? So that comes up in the book with the Black Watch when they have their party, their kind of decompression party at the end of the tour. And it's like, you know, the sergeant majors keep everything in-house, nothing gets reported, and that's considered appropriate. And there must have been a moment with Blackman where someone saw that film and was like, is this going to be a thing? You know, are we going to escalate, or am I going to pretend I never saw that? And you know, it played out in that role. I think that the key point, and I think the reason that Blackman fits in response to Gary's question is it distills this point about accountability, that the Marines determinedly pushed a lone bad apple argument in that case. And, you know, I think, you know, again, there was a huge generation divide about it, but, you know, Blackman clearly did something that was wrong and pretty bad, but it was not an isolated incident. It was affected by these diametrically opposed things. And then interestingly, Oliver Lee, interestingly, Adrian Wheel in the chat has come back on that, saying, I doubt the Blackman film was seen by anyone. I'm not sure that's true, because my understanding is that it bounced, just the mechanics of this, the film was shot, no one knew about it in the chain of command for a year, and my understanding of it is that it bounced around multiple laptops, and then the reason it was found was not, they were fishing for something else. So they were looking for contraband pornography. There was a divorce case, and a Marine's wife said he's got either child or animal pornography on the laptop, and then they found this. So again, I don't know the precise details of that, but it'd be interesting to discuss with Adrian about that in due course. But I think that the point was that Oliver Lee, who was the commanding officer 4-5, he took a personal stand here. And I think Lee is a complicated character, and I really tried to play this as even-handedly as possible, but he resigned. And as we've discussed, like, resignation was very rare in Nick Mercer, the army lawyer, who again made a kind of stand about other issues. It was rare in this situation. So you had a concatenation of an individual factor, this chain of command that was trying to paint it one way, and a man who made a stand. And I think that was kind of compelling. But again, what I tried to do with Blackman was just to tell the story. And what was fascinating was it's all there. There was this huge court case that happened. So there was an enormous amount of material that was in the public domain. And people spoke to me, and I had sources, people who were still serving, who talked often, I think, because they felt that Lee had been railroaded. But ultimately, largely what I was able to do was to piece together a narrative that existed in disparate form and put it in context. And a serving army officer who was on that tour said, like, I've just read this chapter, like, it suddenly all fits. I suddenly see what was happening at that stage. Yeah, so that's that.
Well, let's open it up. I'll go kind of in order. Everyone, please send questions, and we'll try and get to them. Let's start off with Ed D. You mentioned that some people are angered by the book. What specifically makes them angry, and do they dispute your facts or your conclusions?
It's an interesting point. I think there's a tonal point that is that I think has caused anger, and that I wanted to write a book that, as we've discussed, was not like a book about the army it usually is. I wanted to have, I suppose there are a couple of things. I wanted it to have a rawness to it. I wanted, in terms of how I read about casualties and things like that. I also wanted it to have a kind of wryness to it, that this wasn't a genuflection, that it would, that it would use humor and it'd be wry. I think what's interesting is because it took so long, the whole process, that in a sense, it is an angry young man's book, and I'm an older person now, and I recognize that it's something from a kind of different stage of my life in a sense. But I also think it's important that it survives that artifact, because ultimately it was people who were young people who fought these wars, and often who bore the human consequences. So it has a kind of, I broke the rules for how you're meant to write about it, and I named people, and there are things about it that sort of are quasi-satirical, so that clearly caused outrage. In terms of actually questioning it, the lines of pushback have been twofold, essentially. The first one was like, I think we can swear on this, the sort of what the fuck does he know argument, which I think is very understandable if I did a year in the army and things like that. But actually, that when people have seen the book, that has faded in many ways. That's not really the pushback. The kind of party line largely now is like, it doesn't address the politics, which I think there is some value to that. But I also think, like, it's not like there hasn't been an extensive, very public, very open debate about the politics of engagement, particularly in Iraq. It's not like that discussion has not happened, and where the focus has been on the internal army discussion. And there've been various people who said, like, it's all nonsense. So Max Hastings in the Sunday Times, he wrote this sort of fascinatingly mixed review where he clearly agreed with a lot of it, but disagreed with my right to say it. He said, like, it's 50% is untrue, but he gave no examples. And I think in terms of, I know I spelt Field Marshal with 2 L's rather than 1. That is on me. And also I got one Andy. I mixed up 2 Andy's surnames. So that is both on me. But in terms of actual other mistakes, I don't think anyone has pushed back on it. So there's been a lot of, like, there've been a number of kind of lines and a lot of what on earth do you know? But actually, there's been a lot of, like, that's why I'm glad it has the footnotes in, right? That everyone can see, and the stuff is all there. And, you know, I think James mentioned that I put James Cowan's letter in there, and I thought that was important, you know, to give people an opportunity and a right to respond. But yeah, it's there's been a fair amount of kind of ad hominem towards me, which is understandable because there's elements of ad hominem in the book as well. But you know, it's they don't like being questioned in many ways. You know, I've written about all sorts of individuals and institutions, from tobacco firms to West African warlords to Ronan Keating, and you know there is this is well documented. It's not my experience, but you know, armies are uncomfortable with this stuff.
Right. I mean, as you say, it's not. It's often less what you're saying, but your place to say it.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
Who are you?
And I understand that, you know, also I was not a war correspondent who covered these wars, right? I did a brief trip to Afghanistan in 2014, but this is reported as a historian would do it. And, you know, I can understand that raises hackles. I think it's also a time period thing, you know, that we're still sufficiently close to this, that, you know, there's a feeling that people who experience it primarily firsthand have first refusal on it. And that I think is understandable as well. But ultimately, you know, there'll be a historiography for this that will go on for decades, and that will continue.
Let's take another question. So from James Goodwin, talking about accountability. It's quite a long question. I'll get to the question. Can you expand on your reasons for the failure in accountability, and offer any other views on underscoring or improving that accountability?
I think it's about stake. I think I'm just looking at James's question, and James has contributed really thoughtfully to the discussion about the book on Twitter, for which I'm grateful. I think it's about stake. That's the fundamental thing. You know, the point that I made in the Times op-ed at the weekend was like, when things really matter, when the continued survival of a country and nation state is on the line, everything changes in the relationship between politicians and the military. So firing generals is the obvious example. And Tom Ricks is the guy to look at for this in the US context. It's much broader than Britain. And I think there is a sense that it didn't really matter. You know, that is the kind of brutal truth of it. For Britain, for most people, for the government, these were wars that were run far away by a professional army. There were maybe 2 times, particularly, that the continued survival of the British Premiership was imperiled. So 2007, the end of Iraq with casualties, and 2009, the IED summer in Afghanistan. But usually it wasn't important enough to have that re-gearing. I think that what you also have to think about is, you know, the idea that they literally promoted everyone, which is kind of true and is shocking, but that makes sense when you think about it as a system, and that system existed to create at the ultimate, it's a pyramid. So at the ultimate level, you needed a new chief of the general staff every 2 years, who, the way the army works is he'd have to have done X job and Y job and Z job, and there's a sort of way up to it. And there's a whole system that churns and moves through to deliver people. And that system is geared to deliver people regardless of whether the army is on operations or not, you know. And actually the way it was conceived was, if you're on operations, it's a bonus, but it's a bonus regardless really of how the operation goes. So again, it's a point about, it's a kind of human resources piece, really. But I think there is it's a really difficult question. And I think part of it is actually about diversity, is about, you know, not necessarily in a sort of, let's quote ethnicity or so forth, but the problem is partly because the army is very small now, that it has a tendency to behave like a club, you know. And again, this is about incentives. It's not about individuals. It's like, people know each other. It's small, you know, let's cover stuff up. Let's keep it all in house. And I wonder if there's a way to kind of break that out a little bit, to have, to have more external input. And it's useful to think about this in a notion of, what do militaries have monopolies on and what do they not? So essentially the area that the army has a monopoly on is the organization of violence. Ultimately, it does that, which no other institution really does, except for the police on a sort of off day. And that is clearly where its expertise has. But if you think about, you know, large scale procurement or running a large fleet of vehicles or IT management, like, the army has to do all those sort of things, but it does not have a monopoly on that, and it really struggles with those things. So in terms of one particular thing that I think might be a good idea, even though it's much further down the tree, would be to have an obligatory slot at what's called SO2 level, so at major, to go and spend 2 years in a civilian organization outside the army. So these would be people who've been in for about 10 years. And there is already a scheme to offer this. Partially, it's developing. I think it's positive, but I think it takes place too late. So it happens at lieutenant colonel level, so you'd be in 17, 18 years maybe. And people at that stage have been in longer, but also they're really committed to the army generally if you're at that stage. I think if it's lower, the first thing is also that military people would have a lot to offer these organizations, that they're smart and they're capable and they can plan under pressure, and they would, it would benefit two ways, but send them to charities, to businesses, to that kind of thing. And then you come back and, there is a point here that at the moment, the people who run armies have literally never done anything else. Now, it's not as acute as it was when they didn't go to university, generally when they joined at 18, but there still is, it is striking, that thing. And I got a lot of flack for the way that I wrote about, the way that generals talked and their sort of tweaks and stuff. But there is a point here about institutionalization, right? And that is, again, if you have literally joined an institution at 21 and spent your entire professional career in it, that shapes who you are at a fairly profound level. And I think that you could crack some of that without losing the necessity and the benefit that it comes from. But it's a really thorny question. And essentially it's about how do you create high stakes when the stakes are not high for the country? They obviously are for the bloke with the bomber out of the ground, but it's a difficult thing. And again, it's about incentives.
There's a good question I want to get to here from Willem Marks. You've worked on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah, I mean, essentially the big brother in the room of all Western armies is the Americans, right? And if anybody's seen the two standing next to each other, it's I mean, there's almost no comparison. What are the differences in mentality and mindset that you've encountered as a journalist when it comes to reporting on these different institutions, and the US and UK military in particular? Do you think the British media has shaped the way the British military is covered, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's great to have a question, Willem. And again, we have a kind of similar background in that he's British, but he did his journalistic training in the US. So again, it's just worth talking about how process works generally. So generally with the US, you can embed without restriction. So it's not as open a situation as it was in Vietnam, where literally you could get a civilian flight to Saigon, go and get a press card and jump on a helicopter. And in that case, it was like student journalists and people with no experience with doing it. That is not the case now. But in general, the US will allow pretty unfettered media access. So I talk in the book about the experience of Sebastian Junger, who wrote War, and Tom Ricks, and these, or someone like David Finkel. So they did multiple month-long embeds with US troops, where there was my understanding of it is that there's like a basic set of ground rules about what is secret, but beyond that, particularly that the military doesn't see it. There's no suggestion that they have oversight on it or anything. Whereas in Britain, relationships between the press and the serving military are governed by a document called the Green Book that runs back to the 1950s, and essentially what it is an access pre-publication oversight transaction. So in order to get access to serving military people, you have to sign this document that then allows them to have oversight on your product, ostensibly for reasons of operational security, which is like military secrets, or personnel security, which is kind of people's names, they don't want to be in there. But what invariably happens is this is used as a crowbar to gut stuff. So that's what happened with Toby Harnon's book, and endless examples of that. And I was, from my kind of American journalistic DNA from being at Columbia, so I was just like, I'm just not going to do that. It's editorially bankrupt. And I was clear from the start that I wasn't going to do that, but I also knew I needed to get to Afghanistan. This was in 2014 before they left. And the way I was able to circumvent that in the end was I got The Economist, with whom I had a pre-existing relationship as a freelancer, to sponsor an embed. So they wrote the paperwork, and it took months to organize. And I got like less than 2 weeks. It was really difficult to set up. And what we'd found looking at the way it was agreed was that if I played the game for an embed under those circumstances, they would have oversight on that, but they would not have oversight on a subsequent book. And duly, they tried to rewrite everything and all of that. So I was kind of able to navigate it. But that is the game as British defense correspondents have to play it. And these are good and professional journalists doing these things, working with integrity within them. But the system as it is configured is essentially antithetical to that. And I think changing that would be critical. But I also think that would have to be externally politically mandated, because it wouldn't happen. And what I wanted to say in this book, the reason I kind of wrote some of the publishing story about McNab and so forth, is the point that, you know, I don't think people realize that almost every directly reported book about the British military over the last 20 years was edited by the British military. You know, it's never disclosed. It's not on the cover. People never say that. And, you know, the immediate response would be, we can't do that, we'd be imperiling our troops or whatever, but the Americans don't do it. You know, that is the fundamental, and I don't think the French do it either as well, actually. So I think that there is, you know, there's the question we talked about before about this idea of sort of genuflection, and, you know, that we have to, you know, that certain sections of the media regard criticism as treasonous, but there is also a set of systems that are supporting this system. And I think, again, I've never been a defense correspondent, so I'm not directly aware of the pressures that they face, but as in any job like that, you are dependent on your access, right? And if you do not, you know, there is anecdotal at least, and probably more substantial evidence that if you rock the boat, you get thrown out and you don't get access. And that, I think, is problematic. So I think ultimately to resolve those things, it would require political input. It would require Parliament to say, like, okay, it's 2021, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to change it. But that would be a major reform.
I mean, to speak to that point, I mean, it's fascinating what you described. I did embed with the Americans for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you know, tip of the spear and all that. And in the end, although we campaigned for months to get the very first tank over into Iraq, and which I was in, it did nothing. I just did essentially armed parking for a month or so, except for when some poor Iraqi civilians appeared, and then they were all killed. And the Americans did nothing to stop me writing those stories. Didn't even look over my shoulder. Didn't, you know, there was no feedback coming down from command of what was appearing in Time magazine at the time. It was, you know, I was just with them, and they just seemed to be thinking that they were going to be famous, and that was great. Yeah. We're coming quite close. A lot of what you're describing here made me think, as you know, reporting is a very organic process. You know, you gather more and more, you change your ideas. How much of this book was the book that you set out to write? How much of it is different? I mean, did you end up in a very different place from where you started?
It's a really good question. And there's a level of this which is just about technical, like, literary craftsmanship, really. And the book, the fundamental issue, I suppose, that I had putting this book together was, how do you structure it, right? Because you're writing about almost 20 years. And there are books that try and do this chronologically. So, you know, Theo Farrell's book does, and there are other accounts that basically write about every 6-month roulement rotation and what happened. And I felt, those are worthy books, and I used them as sources, but I felt that was if you do that, you're creating a huge burden for yourself, because your narrative structure is difficult. And essentially what I wanted to do was to kind of zoom in to zoom out. So to write about these smaller groups of people, and therefore use that to tell the broader story. And the book, as initially conceived initially, was that there would be sections of narrative prose, and then sections of analysis. And where that was all shot down when it's being sold, I think correctly, a correct editorial decision that, you know, the narrative is what grips people. And I'm really touched that this book has been described as very readable and very gripping, and a lot of that is due to Rachel Beale, who copy edited it, I think. But it is, you know, it's a story. And then there was this conceit of how, you know, what would be the shape of it. And the initial idea, I don't know if anyone's clocked this actually, would be that the organizing conceit would be something called the section battle drill, which is a mnemonic that soldiers are taught about essentially how you behave in a fight. So it goes preparation for battle, reaction to effective enemy fire, enemy location, winning the firefight, assault, reorganization. So there was going to be 6 of them, each named after that. In the end, only the first of those titles survived, and the last section got killed, because my editor was just saying, like, this is getting too long. It was meant to be something about, you know, Britain, in the army in Britain. So it changed shape in that. In terms of its ideas, I think it's tricky, isn't it? Because you know, these things, as you say, it's an organic process. And, like, for example, that opening scene of the book, which again has attracted a lot of comments about the guy on a training exercise in Canada dressed in full World War II regalia. Mm-hmm. The way that happened, the analogy I kind of use is a bit like it's like a sort of whirlpool. You know, I remember talking to someone who was like, oh yeah, Scots DG had a long-serving NCO who was doing the exercise in Waffen-SS gear, and I was like, okay, obviously your journalistic ears sort of prick up, and then you hear more and more and more, and talk to people, and eventually I spoke to him, and he confirmed it all. So that was not conceived at all in that sense. I think what, in retrospect, like any, I think it's a really sound point about any creative project, which is that you start with a vision and you end with a compromise, right? And I think that's from Nick Heitner, who's a theatre director. But it would have been good to have more, voices who were not British troops, right? And so particularly, say, with that second section in with the Black Watch, it would have been fantastic if I'd had like the 17-year-old Iraqi guy who was firing the mortars, right? That and that run as a parallel story behind it. And I didn't get that stuff. And I think that is I think there are books, like, people can write that kind of book about Vietnam and stuff now because enough time has passed, and you can there's the access and that kind of thing. So it has a sort of British focus with that. I think it's weird though. I was talking to Paige, actually, who's on the thread here, and I was saying to her that I don't actually think in any definable way you write a book. You don't sit down and do it. I think you do a whole lot of reporting and phone calls and all that, and then you write a draft, and then there's an edit, and then you have feedback, and essentially it's produced through a discussion with your editor. And actually, the guy who edited this book at Random House, although it all went sour at the end, he did a really good job. Like, he really understood like how books should be edited and stuff. And the way this is produced is ultimately been out of a discussion between myself and him. I didn't, I think a key thing that I've learned more about writing is it's a lot less of a individual sport than you think it is. It's a discussion, and that continues now as the book is out.
Like the army. How are we doing for time, Sarah?
We're technically out of time, so it might be a good point to wrap up there.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Alex. Really, really fascinating questions. That
was brilliant. And I'm going to just invite anybody who would like to put their camera on just to sort of wave goodbye. I'll unmute you and I'll give you the power to start your video if you should so choose, because I'm sure there's a lot of friends and family here who'd like to have the chance to say hello. Yeah. So yeah, I think all that remains really is just to say congratulations, Simon. I think this book is a huge achievement, and I think everyone here can agree with that. I was in fact anticipating some hecklers, and there haven't been any hecklers so far. So I don't know if you're disappointed.
Yeah, I'd just like to say to Simon, as someone ex-military that left, that's still sort of, you can never break away from it. Despite the fact it's nearly 700 pages, and they're probably very good at breaking windows with it. Is an outstanding piece of writing, and it's something that I would recommend anyone to read who's been in and now out, because actually may answer some of the questions why many people left.
Thanks, sure. I mean, that means a great deal. I should say as well that I've had just my post bag has been kind of bulging since this came out, and I haven't been able to get back to everyone, but these kind of messages from people who lived through these experiences, who say that it is meaningful for them, are in some ways.
Your book was a book that I bought before RCB, which had a red cover on it. It was like the British Army from 1945 to about 1985. Sorry, I'm aging myself a bit there, but it's the closest come to that, and that was all about the regimental system and so on. So really well done, and I wish you all the best with it.
Thanks, Sean. That means a great deal. Cheers.
Great. Thank you for that. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. One more reminder that you can order the book online from Fox Lane Books or anywhere that you prefer, but Fox Lane has got its own copies. And I think we'll close there. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone.